Hello, my name's Simone and I am a counselling psychologist, and I work with quite a lot of men, which might come as a surprise because I am a feminist therapist. And that doesn't mean that I'm a man hater, as much as it is tempting to collapse it down into that category. What it means is that I've spent most of my adult life being curious about gender ideology and politics. And how gender ideology in the political framework that we are currently experiencing shapes our sense of self, our embodiment. So I, as a feminist therapist, don't look to pit men and women against each other or privilege men and women, but more just be curious about how our ideas about gender shape our sense of self and also the way we cope. Now, something came up today in therapy with a man, and it made me think, well, this is probably important to share, because he said that he learned really early to avoid his own emotion, because he learned that nobody was interested, there was nowhere to go with it anyway. And then later on in his adolescence, he learned that culturally there was an implicit message where being a good man meant that you weren't emotional, because emotions were in the domain of femininity. And so there's very good research as well to suggest that, to tell us quite literally that as young as age 5, boys stop being relational, they stop being emotional, which means they stop being curious about themselves. They actually disconnect from themselves. And this is a self-limiting system, but I'll go into that in a minute, because I just want to show you this book called The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks writes that the first violence that boys and men enact is not upon others, but upon themselves. The violence is against themselves because they actually learn to disembody themselves. They disconnect from their own emotion. And that is a violence, and it creates a self-limiting system. And why is that? It's because if you disconnect from your own emotion, you disconnect from your own empathy, from your own self-compassion. And if you can't have empathy for yourself and forgive yourself, you develop shame. And that means you can't connect to anyone else's emotion without feeling as though it is about you and what you are trying to push down. And this produces defensiveness, which is highly anti-relational. It's a self-limiting system because what happens is then men in relationship with women who are constructed to be emotional don't know how to relate on that level. They relate from a level which is much more, can we please avoid this? Can we please push it to one side? And, Esther Perel, one of my favourite therapists, says the quality of our lives is determined by the quality of our relationships. And we know from research that our primary romantic relationships, our friend relationships, our relationships with our dogs, our kids, these attachment bonds actually change the physiology of us. Good relationships produce good health. We also know that good relationships are the single most important defining factor in longevity. You can do whatever you like. You can eat whatever you like. You can go to the gym. You can eat all your protein, have all your fiber, avoid all your alcohol, go vegan. I don't care. If you've got shitty relationships, nothing you do is going to compensate for that determining factor in your life. So it's a self-limiting system because the system tells men avoid emotion and then expects men to be able to go out into the relational world with values of money, power, strength, stoicism, and produce good relationships. But it doesn't. We know it doesn't. And it's a little bit like capitalism is self-limiting in a way, because capitalism depends on a wealth gap and eventually it eats itself because the production force inevitably become more and more disheartened and unwell. We can see it happening at the moment. The whole system is crumbling around us. There's huge chaos in this system. I think we need to be curious about how the soup we're swimming in gets in. We can't differentiate without examining within ourselves what is the system and what is our authentic self. And my appeal really as a therapist in this space, and I don't think therapy can solve everything, and I think if we had good communities who were well connected, I'd be out of a job. But my appeal is to allow the messiness of the human experience to be felt, and allow yourself to be curious about yourself. Be curious about your experience. Ask yourself better questions, and not about what others are, telling you that hits you at the level of your identity. Allow things to hit you at the level of experience, of behavior. Anyway, thoughts from the couch, I guess. Okay, bye.